Hey guys, tonight we step into a room lit only by the trembling glow of a single candle. The air smells faintly of beeswax and lavender water, and you hear the gentle rustle of silk brushing against wood. Outside, London's fog presses against the window panes like a living thing, soft and pale, muffling the world to a hush. Inside, the walls breathe with secrets, whispers of lace and vows and the steady heartbeat of anticipation. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. You're about to walk through the doorway of a Victorian bedroom on a wedding night, a moment both sacred and terrifying, tangled in duty, ritual, and expectation. Tonight, we'll uncover how it truly felt to be a woman in that moment, what she saw, what she feared, what she could never say out loud. From candlelit superstitions to corseted truths, we'll unravel the silence that wrapped around her like lace. You stand in the dim bedroom, the heavy scent of rosewater clinging to the air, the sheets are cool linen, the mattress stuffed with horsehair that sighs when touched. There's a faint chill from the window, though the curtains are drawn tight. Everything here feels rehearsed, as if even the shadows have been trained to behave. You notice how the silence is thicker than comfort. Soon, this quiet will matter more than anything else. In many Victorian homes, the bridal bedroom was decorated in pale colors, cream, ivory, or soft pink, a symbol of purity that seemed more for display than comfort. Lace edged every surface. Flowers, often orange blossoms, perfumed the air. The setting wasn't romantic by accident. It was deliberate theater. The room existed to reflect virtue, not passion. You can almost sense how that expectation pressed against every breath. Beds in this era were symbols of social class as much as intimacy. A middle-class woman might have slept on stiff sheets with scratchy embroidery, meant to impress guests rather than please the skin. Wealthier brides rested beneath canopies, velvet drapes, and carved mahogany posts that groaned like old trees. In either case, the bed wasn't just furniture, it was an altar. One where innocence was both worshipped and sacrificed. You imagine how a young woman might have stood by that bed, still in her corset, unsure whether to sit or keep standing. The faint tick of the clock felt louder than breathing. In her chest, a storm of dread and curiosity swirled together. Every object around her, the candle, the mirror, the linen, became part of the ritual. The moment had weight, the kind that pressed down more than it lifted. Victorian homes rarely allowed privacy, and even on her wedding night, the bride's body was not entirely her own. Servants had helped undress her earlier, loosening stays and laces while offering rehearsed congratulations. They knew what would follow. She knew they knew. The awareness settled like dust. Nothing about this was spontaneous. Even the intimacy was supervised by etiquette manuals and whispered rules. The furniture itself seemed to participate. Wardrobes creaked like old witnesses. The bedposts threw long, skeletal shadows that bent across the wallpaper. You hear the faint snap of the fire shrinking in the grate. Imagine her touching the fabric, cool under her fingertips, feeling the embroidery catch against her nails. The world had narrowed to this room, and this moment yet felt impossibly vast with what-ifs. A Victorian bride was expected to be modest, but not ignorant. The contradiction made for quiet confusion. Mothers sometimes handed down vague warnings wrapped in euphemisms. Be patient, dear. or he'll be gentle in time. Those phrases hung in the air like ghosts, too polite to tell the truth. You can almost feel her heart beating against those half-truths, steady and uncertain. Lighting mattered deeply in such moments. Gas lamps were too harsh, so most brides relied on candlelight. Soft, forgiving, merciful. Shadows hid the awkwardness that words couldn't. The flicker made everything seem slower, safer, like time itself was exhaling. It's strange how even fear looks beautiful by candlelight. In the corner, a small porcelain jug and basin waited, filled with water that had gone tepid hours ago. Hygiene was ritualized, not for health, but for decorum. The faint smell of soap mixed with sweat and perfume created a scent that was both pure and human. She would have washed her hands, maybe her face, uncertain how much clean was expected for what was coming next. A Bible might sit on the nightstand, unopened but present. A silent reminder that marriage was holy, even when it didn't feel kind. The woman might glance at it, wondering if it would judge her, or protect her, or both. Faith and fear shared the same pillow. You can feel that irony, like the warmth of a candle that burns too close to your hand. For all the grandeur, most wedding nights were painfully ordinary. There were coughs, awkward laughter, apologies whispered into the dark. Sometimes exhaustion replaced romance entirely. The fantasy that novels had promised dissolved under the weight of wool blankets and expectation. And yet, there was something human in that imperfection. Something oddly tender in not knowing what to do. So the room breathed quietly, the way only old houses can. Outside, the city was a sea of gaslights and fog. Inside, a woman waited, feeling both chosen and trapped. You can almost hear the faint rhythm of her thoughts, the gentle panic that sounds like a heartbeat. Soon, that rhythm will lead us deeper, beyond the lace, beyond the silence, into what truly unfolded when the world went dark. The first sound is always the sigh, that faint, private exhale when the laces loosen. You can almost hear it now, the creak of fabric and the soft click of metal stays releasing their grip. The air rushes back into her lungs like an apology. After hours of posture and performance, her spine feels foreign, her ribs tender from the embrace of expectation. In this moment, freedom is not a concept, it's simply the ability to breathe. Corsets were meant to sculpt a woman into virtue itself. A perfect hourglass that spoke of discipline, delicacy, and restraint. But they were also prisons stitched in silk, whalebone and steel pressed against soft flesh until felt normal, even elegant. You imagine the marks they left, red lines tracing the outline of society's approval. To be beautiful was to be compressed. Removing one wasn't graceful. It was slow, clumsy, and oddly intimate. The fabric would cling to damp skin, strings tangling around fingers, trembling from fatigue. For many brides, this was the first undressing that wasn't performed alone. The thought of it, another person's hands fumbling with laces, carried both fear and a strange relief. Every pull of a ribbon was an exchange of power. The undergarments beneath were hardly scandalous by modern standards. A chemise, long and plain, usually cotton or fine linen, protected the corset from sweat. It was the closest thing to modesty that modesty allowed. Yet under candlelight, even simplicity could seem daring. The thin fabric caught the flame's warmth, turning into a soft outline of vulnerability. You almost want to look away, even in imagination. Victorian modesty wasn't truly about concealment. It was about control. A woman's clothing was a constant negotiation with propriety. Layers upon layers separated her from spontaneity. Each button, each hook, another reminder that her body was a matter of protocol. To undress was not just to reveal skin, it was to risk being unseemly, even when married. Imagine how her fingers must have trembled, not from cold, but from awareness, that peculiar vertigo of realizing how much she didn't know. The corset fell away, and suddenly her body no longer fit its script. Shoulders slumped, breath deepened. It's strange how the act of release can feel so much like exposure. Freedom, in that room, was its own kind of fear. Some women found humor in it. Diaries occasionally mention brides laughing nervously as they struggled with stubborn hooks or ribbon knots that refused to yield. The absurdity of it, the clashing of ceremony and reality, was almost comforting. For a brief second, laughter turned the unknown into something human. Even terror can soften when it sounds like a giggle. And then came silence again, the sound of laces brushing against the floor. The candle flame twitching from the movement, the faint hum of her own pulse echoing in her ears. You can picture her looking down at the garment now lying deflated on the rug, like a hollow version of herself, one she'd worn all day, smiling, nodding, pretending to understand what was coming next. It's easy, from our distance, to romanticize this scene, to imagine a graceful unveiling like in some oil painting. But in truth, most of it was practical, awkward, uncertain. Corsets pinched, hooks caught hair, hands hesitated, and yet, amid all that imperfection, something honest flickered. The world outside that bedroom had rules. In here, for the first time, she was learning her own. For the woman standing there, the night was not yet about passion. It was about surrender, though not necessarily to someone else. It was to the unfamiliar rhythm of her own heartbeat, the strangeness of her body rediscovered beneath candlelight. You sense that what mattered most wasn't what followed, but that fleeting moment when the corset lay still and she could finally feel human again. Outside, the fog pressed thicker against the glass. The city had gone to sleep, but she was only just waking into herself. Soon, we'll see what waited beneath the quiet, the customs, the fears, and the unspoken scripts that shaped this long, uneasy night. The fabric feels lighter than air. White lawn cotton, maybe fine muslin, soft enough to whisper when it moves. It smells faintly of starch and lavender, pressed earlier that day by a maid who didn't dare imagine its purpose. The neckline rests high, lace edging brushing against the collarbone. Every detail is meant to promise innocence. You can almost hear the faint rustle as she pulls it over her head, the last ritual before the candle dims. Victorian nightdresses were not designed for allure. They were modest, voluminous, and often buttoned at the throat, a paradoxical uniform for a night that was anything but innocent. Yet the act of putting it on carried its own meaning. It marked the end of one identity, the maiden, and the beginning of another. Fabric became a veil between expectation and fear, between myth and skin. The whiteness of the gown was its own sermon. White stood for purity, submission, the triumph of virtue over desire. But under candlelight, that whiteness betrayed its own vulnerability. The way the flame traced faint shadows along the seams, revealing more than it hid. You sense how she might have held her breath, aware that even modesty could look indecent if seen from the wrong angle. Some brides embroidered their initials into the hem, delicate, almost invisible, stitched by hand in the weeks before the wedding. A quiet act of ownership in a world where her name would soon change. Imagine her fingers working the needle late at night, the thread trembling like her thoughts. The nightdress became her last secret, one that belonged to her alone, at least for now. Textiles were intimate witnesses in this era. Cotton came from distant colonies, lace from Belgian looms, silk from China. Every piece of the gown carried a story of trade and touch, of hands she would never see. To wear it was to be wrapped in the world's contradictions. Luxury sewn by labor. Perhaps she sensed that, faintly, as she smoothed the fabric down and listened to it breathe against her skin. Etiquette manuals insisted that a bride should not appear too eager to disrobe nor too shy to comply. Even her gestures were regulated, how she folded her hands, how she looked away, how long she waited before extinguishing the light. Each movement was choreography designed to preserve grace. You can feel how exhausting that must have been, to perform serenity while trembling inside. The bedroom light glows soft and golden, catching on the folds of her gown. Outside, a horse carriage clatters faintly down a cobblestone street, then fades. Inside, the quiet thickens. The nightdress, once a garment, becomes armor. Its softness is deceptive. Beneath it, she hides not from the man beside her, but from the weight of everything she's been told. Somewhere in the house, a servant might be listening, out of curiosity or habit. In Victorian homes, thin walls carried stories faster than gossip. A creak, a muffled laugh, the sound of footsteps on polished wood. Nothing stayed private for long. Even the most sacred moments were echoes in someone else's routine. You can almost feel her awareness of that, the way her stillness sharpens into composure. It's tempting to see her as fragile, but fragility was part of the costume. Beneath the lace and quiet demeanor was endurance, the kind that learns to smile through discomfort, to survive through politeness. The nightdress was less a symbol of chastity than of adaptation. It allowed her to inhabit expectation while keeping part of herself untouched. The candle flickers again, its flame bowing low. She sits on the edge of the bed, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing. The world has gone very still. For a moment, the night feels endless, the pause between innocence and initiation. And in that pause, you understand. This isn't a story of romance, but of resilience. Soon, the night will deepen, and the rituals will begin. The air in the room feels rehearsed, as if even the silence has read the instruction manual. You can almost sense the invisible choreography written by generations before her, a list of gestures, pauses, and polite avoidances that shaped the first hours of marriage. The candle burns lower now, its wax pooling like slow breath. In this light, everything looks softer, even the rules. But they're still there, quiet, firm, and heavy as lace. Victorian etiquette did not stop at the bedroom door. Entire guidebooks were written to advise couples on what decorous intimacy should look like. A bride was expected to appear modest, hesitant, and above all, obedient. Passion was acceptable only if it looked accidental. The ideal woman felt deeply, but never visibly. Her stillness was a virtue, her quiet a form of grace. Many brides were told not to extinguish the candle too quickly. Propriety demanded gradual dimming, not abrupt darkness. Even light had manners. She might have adjusted the wick, pretending to busy herself, giving her new husband time to speak first. In these pauses, centuries of expectation echoed like distant footsteps down a corridor. You realize how much of marriage began in silence. The husband, too, was under performance. Manuals spoke of delicacy and self-restraint, reminding men that gentleness was proof of breeding. The first night was as much about civility as desire. Two strangers enacting an unspoken contract of power and patience. In that dim space, humanity flickered between fear and tenderness. A woman was never supposed to reveal knowledge of the body. To know too much implied impropriety. To know nothing made her a child. So she existed somewhere in between. An actress improvising a role without a script. Her responses, her questions, her very posture became cues in a play she had only just entered. You can feel her uncertainty hanging in the air like perfume. Some couples, overwhelmed by exhaustion or nerves, did nothing at all. Letters and diaries speak of nights spent simply talking or pretending to sleep. In such moments, etiquette became a refuge, a safe excuse for postponement. The fear of doing something wrong outweighed the curiosity of what it meant to do anything at all, and perhaps that, too, was a kind of tenderness. In wealthier homes, the bridal chamber might be visited the next morning by servants changing linens, discreetly observing the evidence of consummation. It was both invasion and validation. Privacy was a luxury even in love. The bed itself became a document, its silence carrying the burden of proof. You can almost imagine the weight of those expectations pressing down like a second blanket. And yet, not every ritual was joyless. Some couples found humor in the absurdity, a shared smile at the formal absurdity of it all, a whispered joke, a stumble over too many buttons, a nervous apology. For a moment, the performance cracked, and something real slipped through. Humanity often hides behind laughter when it's too fragile to speak plainly. The candle burns low enough now that the walls begin to disappear. The edges of the world blur. In this soft, forgiving darkness, etiquette starts to dissolve. The rules still hover, faint, persistent, but so does the quiet rhythm of breathing in unison. For the first time that night, the silence feels shared. And outside, London sleeps on, gas lamps flickering, fog curling through the streets, unaware of the quiet revolutions happening behind drawn curtains. The night goes on, polite and eternal. Soon, we'll step deeper into that world, into the rituals that followed, and the strange blend of fear and fascination that defined a Victorian bride's first night of marriage. The night is still young, though it feels ancient. You hear the faint crackle of the candle's wick, the whisper of linen shifting as she moves. Everything around her seems to carry meaning. Every fold, every breath, every pause. Rituals are strange that way. They turn ordinary acts into symbols, and on this night, symbols are everywhere, pressing gently on the air like the scent of roses that refuses to fade. Victorian rituals surrounding the wedding night varied by class, but they shared one purpose: to transform two individuals into one respectable union. For the upper classes, servants might prepare the room earlier, scattering flowers, warming sheets, ensuring nothing looked too improvised. For the working poor, there was little ceremony beyond exhaustion and perhaps a borrowed candle, yet both, in their own ways, were performances for society's unseen eyes. Some traditions were remnants of superstition. Brides were advised to step into bed with the right foot first, to ensure a harmonious future. In certain regions, a small glass of wine or milk was offered before bed, symbolizing sweetness and fertility. These gestures were fragments of older pagan beliefs, dressed up in Christian virtue. You can almost sense the irony, how the Victorians, so proper in daylight, kept ancient magic hidden in their nightly customs. The act itself was rarely discussed openly, though everyone understood its supposed necessity. The consummation of marriage was less about love than legality, proof that vows had turned into permanence. Yet, the more it was insisted upon, the less it resembled affection. The first night often felt more ceremonial than sensual, a strange echo of a contract signed with candlelight and heartbeat. Many brides carried small charms sewn secretly into their nightdress hems, a sprig of rosemary, a tiny cross, a ribbon gifted by a sister. They were meant to protect against evil influences, but also served as quiet comfort, tangible proof that she wasn't entirely alone. It's easy to picture her fingers brushing against that hidden knot of thread, like holding a friend's hand in the dark. There was often an air of awkward kindness in these moments. Not romance as novels imagined, but cautious understanding. Two people fumbling through rules neither had written. The husband, often no older in experience, relied on assumption and the weight of expectation. And the wife, guided only by silence, learned that compliance could masquerade as grace. The Victorians believed strongly in duty, a word that sounds heavy even now. For a woman, her duty was to yield, for a man, to be restrained. The irony is palpable. Passion was meant to exist, but only within the confines of propriety. Desire had to wear a collar. Even the most private gestures were shaped by invisible etiquette, whispered from mother to daughter like sacred code. There were prayers, sometimes whispered under breath. "God bless this union," she might murmur, or perhaps nothing at all. Just the rhythm of breathing and the slow ticking of a clock somewhere far away. The moment didn't need words. It was already crowded with centuries of them. In that dim room, faith and fear shared the same vocabulary. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. A carriage wheel splashed through puddles. A cat knocked over a tin lid. The fog thickened around the lamps. But here, time felt suspended, not romantic, but tender in its stillness. The rituals, strange and solemn, were less about performance now and more about survival. Doing things the right way was a shield against uncertainty. And when the candle finally leaned towards sleep, the flame thinning to a thread, the rituals were done. Not perfectly, not poetically, but done all the same. The world would never ask how it felt, it would only ask if it happened. Yet within that silence, between heartbeat and breath, something unspoken lingered. The quiet courage of simply enduring the first night of the rest of her life. Soon, as the dawn begins to stir behind the curtains, we'll step into what came next, the morning after, and the new world she woke into. The first light creeps in gently, filtering through lace curtains in pale ribbons of gold and grey. You can almost smell the faint mix of candle smoke and lavender, the scent of a night that's ended but not yet left. The air feels different now, thinner, quieter, the way rooms do after something irreversible. She blinks awake, unsure whether she truly slept, unsure whether the silence means peace or simply the absence of sound. Morning in a Victorian home was never private. Somewhere beyond the door, servants already move through corridors, their footsteps soft but certain. A kettle hums in the kitchen, the fire being coaxed back to life. Life resumes its rhythm, indifferent to the quiet revolutions that took place overnight. You sense her awareness of it, how ordinary the world insists on being, even after transformation. On the dressing table, a small mirror catches the early light. Her reflection looks the same, yet feels entirely altered. Perhaps that's the strangest part. To wake and find that nothing visible has changed, while everything invisible has. The hair slightly undone, the eyes heavier, the skin flushed from the warmth of wool and candlelight. The face of a woman who now carries a title she didn't fully choose, wife. Victorian mornings were filled with ritual, even for new brides. She would ring for tea, perhaps take a sip before anyone entered, the taste of tannin grounding her in something familiar. A maid might enter quietly, pretending not to notice the disarray of the sheets. No words would be exchanged about the night. Discretion was as much part of the job as tea service. Silence was the currency of respectability. For wealthier women, the morning meant congratulations. Visitors would send notes or flowers celebrating domestic bliss as though it were a foregone conclusion. For others, it was simply another work day, washing linens, tending fires, preparing meals. The class divide revealed itself most clearly in how people could afford to feel. Even emotions had social brackets. The husband might already be gone, attending to business, or appearing dutifully composed at breakfast. Marriage, after all, was as much performance as union. The wife, left behind in quiet reflection, would rise and wash in the small porcelain basin, water splashing softly like whispered confession. You can imagine her tracing her own wrist beneath the water, still herself, and not. Some women wrote in diaries that morning, though their entries rarely said much. All went well, they'd write, or he was kind. Polite code for an event too personal to capture. The brevity of their words hides more than it reveals. Centuries of caution condensed into civility. You sense the unspoken beneath every line, the relief, the confusion, the quiet endurance. Breakfast would arrive on a tray. Toast, eggs, perhaps a slice of ham. She might not be hungry, yet she'd eat, mechanically, because that was what one did. She'd been raised on schedules that governed even appetite. Routine is a balm for disquiet. You can almost feel how she leans into it now, letting the ordinary swallow the extraordinary. By mid-morning, the linens would be changed. The servants would avert their eyes, saying nothing, though everyone knew. In this way, privacy was preserved not by walls, but by collective pretense. The house exhaled its secrets quietly, as all Victorian houses did, through decorum. And so the day began, as if nothing monumental had happened. Outside, the city roared to life, carts clattering, vendors shouting, church bells tolling the same indifferent tune. Inside, she adjusted her hair, smoothed her gown, and stepped into the day's polite fiction. The night was over, but its echoes lingered, delicate as lace pressed into memory. You sense, as she does, that this was only the beginning, not of passion, but of performance. The first act of a lifelong play called marriage. Soon, we'll step further into that story, into the deeper chambers of fear, custom, and quiet rebellion that shaped a Victorian woman's world after the vows were done. The morning after, you might imagine she is alone. But she isn't. Somewhere nearby, a maid is folding linen with knowing hands, her eyes steady, her mouth quiet. The maid has seen this before, countless times, in countless rooms. She knows what sounds mean relief, and what silences mean regret. Her hands move rhythmically, smoothing fabric as though erasing evidence. You can almost hear the faint hiss of fabric meeting starch, like secrets being pressed flat. Servants carried more intimacy than any husband ever realized. They dressed brides, brushed hair, buttoned boots, the small rituals of closeness that left traces of empathy behind. In a world where a woman's virtue was guarded yet constantly discussed, the maid became her silent ally. Their relationship was built on gestures, not confessions. One learned to look away at the right moment, and that, too, was a kindness. For many brides, the maid was the only witness of transformation. She had prepared the dress that morning, scented the room, turned down the bed. She had watched the candle burn low through the crack beneath the door. By dawn, she was already tidying what romance left undone. There's something sacred in that quiet efficiency, an unsung devotion to order after chaos. The irony, of course, is that servants often understood more about love than their employers. They saw marriages arranged for fortune, affection, or mere appearance. They watched tenderness fade and tolerance grow. To them, marriage wasn't a mystery, it was labor. Polished silver, replaced sheets, folded hearts. The maid's silence was not ignorance, it was protection. Sometimes she might leave a small kindness, a folded handkerchief, a sprig of lavender tucked into the drawer. Nothing that would break decorum, but just enough to remind the new wife that someone saw her humanity. In a house built on hierarchy, that sliver of solidarity mattered more than any vow. The bride, still adjusting to her new role, would notice. Perhaps she'd pause, fingers brushing the hidden flower, a small anchor of comfort amid the overwhelming sea of propriety. It's strange how connection survives even in systems built to suppress it. Soft rebellion in the shape of courtesy. Of course, not every maid was kind. Some were indifferent, even amused by the pretense. But indifference has its own mercy. It means neutrality, safety. In a world where gossip could ruin reputations, silence was the greatest gift a woman could receive. The walls had ears, but the linen had discretion. There was an unspoken understanding between classes. The mistress pretended ignorance, and the maid pretended invisibility. Both knew more than they admitted. This dance of denial held households together. It wasn't affection that kept the gears turning, it was shared awareness, delicately balanced. For the new wife, that awareness became comfort. She wasn't truly alone, even if she couldn't say so. Someone had seen her tears without asking why, refilled the water without comment, folded the gown with care. In that understated intimacy, a fragile sense of safety was born. By midday, when sunlight filled the hallways, the maid would vanish into her duties, dusting frames, shaking rugs, humming under her breath. The moment was gone, absorbed into routine. But its tenderness lingered, faint as the scent of lavender left behind. And as the day moved forward, the bride began to realize that her quiet allies would not be found in poetry or prayer, but in those invisible acts of grace that kept her world from unraveling. The gold band feels heavier than it looks. You can almost sense its temperature, still warm from the skin, yet cold with meaning. It rests on her hand like a quiet command, smooth and final. The morning light catches it, turning it briefly into fire. For a moment, she studies it the way one might study a key that fits only one door. And though it glows beautifully, it locks as much as it liberates. Victorian rings were rarely simple gestures of love. They were contracts, property markers disguised as jewelry. The moment it slid onto her finger, it signified belonging. She was no longer her father's daughter, but her husband's wife. The transition was sealed in gold, polished and polite. Even the design told a story, plain for modesty, engraved for sentiment, yet always unmistakably circular, symbolizing a bond that had no visible escape. She flexes her fingers slightly, feeling the faint indentation where skin meets metal. It's strange how something so small can alter the way you move. The ring is light in weight, but immense in consequence. She imagines taking it off just for a breath, then hesitates. A married woman without her ring would be cause for whispers. Even her hands are no longer entirely her own. The gold itself often came from colonial mines, Australia, South Africa, extracted by unseen hands far from this quiet London room. Every shine carried the echo of someone else's labor. She doesn't know that, of course, but the ring hums with history all the same. Symbols rarely stay pure once you know their origins. In etiquette books, the wedding ring was described as the visible emblem of wifely honor. That phrase sounds noble until you realize how much it demanded. To lose it, or worse, to remove it willingly, was to invite scandal. The circle of gold wasn't just decoration, it was surveillance. An unbroken loop of expectation. Sometimes she twists it absent-mindedly, the way people touch things that both comfort and confine. It glints under the soft gaslight, a tiny sun bound to her hand. The gesture looks tender to anyone watching, but she knows it's a small rebellion, a motion that reminds her she can still move it, still decide the rhythm of her own gestures. Little freedoms matter most when larger ones are scarce. For poorer women, rings were often brass or silver, their gold plating wearing off within months. Yet the symbolism remained just as binding. Even without wealth, the ritual demanded permanence. Some women would sleep with it still on, afraid to remove it, as if love could vanish with a clink of metal against the nightstand. And yet, the ring could also bring comfort. It was proof that someone had chosen her, a small, tangible promise in a world built on fleeting assurances. The same metal that marked ownership could also feel like safety. That duality defined much of Victorian womanhood. Every comfort carried its own quiet cost. Imagine her later, years on, still twisting that ring in moments of thought, its shine dulled, but its message intact. The symbol becomes part of her hand, her gestures, her identity. It's not a chain anymore, not exactly, more like an echo that never fully fades. You can almost hear the faint clink of it against porcelain as she lifts her teacup, the sound delicate yet final. That single note carries centuries of meaning, devotion, duty, endurance. In a world where words failed women often, jewelry spoke fluently. And this ring, small as it was, said everything that could not be spoken aloud. The room feels heavier when money enters the memory. You can almost sense it in the wallpaper. That faint scent of polish and ink, of contracts sealed over tea and polite smiles. Marriage in the Victorian world was rarely a union of souls. It was an arrangement of ledgers. Even love had an accounting column. Behind every silk veil stood a stack of agreements, written in tidy script by men who would never wear lace gloves or whisper nervous vows. A dowry was both blessing and burden. It was the bride's passport into marriage, and her price tag. Fathers spoke of settlements as though they were arranging shipments of furniture, not futures. £1,000 might secure comfort, 10,000 might ensure admiration. Those without such fortune faced quieter fates. Governess posts, spinsterhood, or whispered pity at social gatherings. You can almost hear the shuffling of those invisible scales. The new bride might never have seen the papers herself. She was the signature, not the signatory. Somewhere, her name appeared in elegant ink, tethered to sums that now defined her worth. The irony is cruel. The same society that praised female purity made her a financial transaction before she ever stood at the altar. The dowry determined not only whom she could marry, but how she would live. It decided the furniture she'd own, the servants she'd command, even the quality of the tea she'd drink each morning. Love might be written into novels, but accounts were written into life. You can feel the strange arithmetic of it, affection measured in pounds and shillings. For poorer families, the absence of a dowry turned daughters into long-term dependents. Many women stayed unmarried not by choice, but by economics. A good heart and a fine face could rarely compete with ready money. And so, drawing rooms filled with hopeful smiles and quiet disappointment, where every conversation was an audition for security. Even among the wealthy, the dowry's shadow followed. A woman might marry well, yet never know if affection or arithmetic guided her fate. Some found comfort in pretense, choosing to believe they were loved despite the ledger. Others found irony in it, learning to wield charm like currency, wit like interest. The clever ones learned that silence was profitable. Her husband might joke lightly about her, bringing fortune to the family, not realizing how deeply those words cut. He'd call her his greatest treasure, meaning both romance and investment. She would smile, because smiling was cheaper than honesty. Politeness was her safest economy. Even gifts between spouses carried economic ghosts. A new necklace might be described as a token of affection, though its cost would be quietly deducted elsewhere. A dress might be praised as generous, yet chosen to display her husband's wealth more than her taste. The dowry had simply changed shape, from numbers to appearances. Yet, in some ways, it gave her leverage. A large dowry could mean freedom, a larger allowance, a say in the household, a softer tone in disagreements. Power wrapped in silk. But it was a delicate kind of power, the kind that only lasted while her usefulness remained visible. At night, she might lie awake, the candle's reflection trembling against her ring, and wonder what part of her was truly hers. Was it the body she now shared? The fortune she brought? Or only the thoughts no one could yet tax? In that quiet hour, you can almost hear her whispering the truth to herself, that every coin traded for her name carried a small echo of her silence, and outside, the city's carriages keep moving, wheels turning like the gears of the same unspoken system. Love and money tangled together, forever indistinguishable in the candlelight. The candle burns low again, its flame thin and wavering, like a secret afraid to be spoken. You can almost feel the chill of the air, how it presses softly against bare skin. The room is too quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but listens. For a young woman on her wedding night, fear wasn't rare, it was expected. A part of the ritual no one admitted existed. Fear wrapped itself around lace and satin as invisibly as scent. Victorian society taught women to fear desire, theirs most of all. To feel it was shameful. To express it was unthinkable. Yet, to not submit to it was rebellion. Imagine that paradox tightening like the stays of her corset. She was told that duty was sacred and pleasure dangerous, and yet both waited behind the same candle flame. No wonder her heart beat so loudly, not in romance, but in bewilderment. Mothers offered warnings disguised as comfort. "Be patient," they'd whisper, "and it will all pass." What that meant, exactly, depended on the listener. Some brides took it to mean pain, others, endurance. The advice was not to understand, but to survive. The unknown was less terrifying when wrapped in euphemism, but the body, honest as always, never learned to lie as fluently as words. The medical world didn't help. Doctors described female desire as a pathology, hysteria waiting to happen. Manuals suggested that women were naturally passionless, incapable of lust without moral decay. You can feel how that belief poisoned intimacy, turning curiosity into guilt. Even a heartbeat could feel like disobedience. Imagine the sound of a door closing softly, the candle flickering lower, the air suddenly smaller. She stands there, her pulse too loud for comfort. Her body is no longer her own stage, it's an examination. The man she loves, or barely knows, becomes both companion and stranger. The distance between them is measured not in inches, but in centuries of silence. Some brides wept quietly, their tears absorbed by pillowcases or mistaken for candle smoke. Others lay perfectly still, hoping stillness might make it end faster or make it seem proper. Fear, in such moments, wore many faces: politeness, fatigue, surrender. Every woman found her own disguise for it. You can almost hear the rustle of linen, the sound of coping dressed as decorum. There were those who, surprisingly, found tenderness even amid that fear. a husband who whispered rather than demanded, a touch that waited instead of taking. The night could turn from dread to relief with a single act of gentleness. For some, that gentleness was the first real lesson of love. But for others, it never came. Outside, the fog thickens, pressing against the window like an audience that never leaves. The city keeps its secrets well. Behind 1,000 similar curtains, the same story unfolds, each with its own shade of fear and silence. It's strange how universal isolation can be. Victorian morality turned fear into virtue. A trembling bride was seen as pure, her terror mistaken for grace. Society applauded her unease as evidence of innocence. To flinch was to be moral, to desire, corrupt. Fear became a performance of femininity. You can almost see her practicing that performance now, even as her breath trembles in the half-dark. By dawn, the fear softens into exhaustion. She will say nothing of it at breakfast. No one will ask. Life resumes. Tea is poured. The sun pretends not to know. Yet that quiet dread lingers, tucked into her memory like a pressed flower, delicate, pale, and impossible to forget. And so begins her real education, not in love, but in silence. The morning sunlight, thin and milky, falls across her face. Somewhere downstairs a clock ticks in steady rhythm, a heartbeat made of brass. She stirs, the soreness quiet but real, the memory vague and heavy. The world insists that everything is fine, that she is now fulfilled, sanctified, proper. But the body, as always, tells the truth in whispers. You can almost feel the ache of unspoken questions. Victorian medicine called itself scientific, yet its gaze upon women was steeped in superstition. Doctors spoke of nervous constitutions, fragile temperaments, and moral hygiene. A woman's virtue, they said, was written in her physiology, as if purity could be dissected and measured. They claimed to know what modesty looked like under a microscope, though none dared look with honesty. The obsession with virginity became a medical curiosity. There were pamphlets, diagrams, even tools designed to verify innocence, as though morality could be confirmed by inspection. The hymen, that tiny fold of tissue, became an empire's obsession. Men built reputations upon its mystery. Women lost theirs over its misunderstanding. You can almost hear the absurdity echoing through history's polished halls. Doctors spoke in tones of authority, but their language was drenched in fear. They warned that excessive emotion could cause uterine displacement, that reading novels might inflame desire, that education could damage fertility. In their world, intellect and innocence could not coexist. A clever woman was a biological contradiction. You can feel how that lie seeped into every corner of domestic life. A new bride, still trembling from her first night, might find herself inspected not for illness, but for morality. Her pallor would be read as modesty, her silence as virtue. If she smiled too easily, it was cause for concern. The line between medicine and judgment blurred until it vanished entirely. Even her health was not her own. Meanwhile, men's indiscretions were treated as medical inevitabilities, natural urges that women were expected to heal through marriage. The wife, in this arrangement, was both cure and patient. The phrase marital duty was the prescription. You can almost hear the cruel irony in it, that the very act she feared was deemed her therapy. Some doctors genuinely believed that women felt no pleasure, that their bodies were passive instruments of duty. This myth, repeated often enough, became doctrine. And yet, diaries and letters whisper otherwise. Fragments of secret joy, confusion, tenderness. The truth lived quietly, hidden between clean pages and coded words. The ideal woman was a paradox, untouched yet fertile, submissive yet nurturing, silent yet always listening. She was expected to glow with virtue, but never sweat with effort. Medicine, religion, and etiquette all conspired to keep her still. Beautiful in the same way a painting is, unmoving, framed, owned. You can feel the injustice of it hum softly beneath the lace. There were women who questioned it, of course. Writers, reformers, even midwives who saw the hypocrisy firsthand. They spoke of health as freedom, of education as strength. Their words were small lanterns in a dark corridor, often ignored, sometimes mocked, but never extinguished. The whisper of resistance had begun, even if it was only a murmur. And somewhere, perhaps in that very house, a new wife might catch wind of such ideas. A page half read from a forbidden magazine, a sentence overheard from a daring friend, it would stir something in her, faint but real. The quiet realization that purity was never a medical condition and fear was never a virtue. The myths might remain, but their cracks had started to show. The house smells faintly of tea and starch. Somewhere downstairs, someone is laughing softly, but she doesn't join in. You can picture her, the young bride, sitting by the window, light pooling on her lap. Her hands rest over the folds of her gown, still pale and deliberate. She thinks of her mother, and suddenly the silence feels familiar. A silence not of absence, but of inheritance. The kind that moves quietly through generations, disguised as composure. Victorian mothers rarely spoke of the wedding night. They prepared daughters for propriety, not intimacy. Lessons were sewn into hems, baked into etiquette, whispered between pauses. The advice was always indirect. Be patient, be good, remember your duty. Words like love and pleasure stayed locked behind polite smiles. You can almost hear the spaces between sentences, the careful avoidance, stitched with affection and fear. For many women, motherhood was the first time they began to understand their own mothers. Only then did the silences make sense, the caution, the restraint, the weary tenderness. Experience revealed what words could never safely hold. That revelation came too late for most. By the time they understood, they were already repeating the same quiet choreography. Letters from the era sometimes reveal this cycle. "My dearest girl," one mother writes, "the world is not as gentle as you imagine. Be kind to him, and he will learn to be kind." Between the lines lies the truth. Endurance disguised as optimism. The tone is warm, the message cold. Generations of women passing down survival like a family heirloom. The silence wasn't cruelty, it was protection. In a society where speaking plainly could brand you vulgar, mothers learned to wrap warnings in lace. Better to teach compliance than let a daughter be crushed by honesty. It was a pragmatic love, flawed but deeply human. You can almost feel that ache, the guilt of knowing and not saying. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, the young bride would remember her mother's eyes, the faint worry hidden behind wedding day pride. Maybe she understood now what that look meant. The soft sadness beneath congratulations. The awareness that innocence was about to become experience, and that experience would never again be innocent. In some households, women found subtle ways to speak. They used gesture, glances, or the small gift of a book slipped into a drawer, something improper but quietly liberating. These rebellions were tender, not loud. The wisdom of women often survived through implication, not declaration. The unspoken was their chosen language. Still, the cost of silence was heavy. Many daughters entered marriage with the faith of children and the fear of women. They mistook endurance for virtue because no one told them otherwise. Their mothers, too, had once waited in the same candlelight, unsure whether to feel proud or frightened. It's haunting, that repetition, like a melody hummed by memory itself. And yet, despite the restraint, love existed fiercely between them. It showed in the careful packing of a trunk, the hem mended by tired hands, the lavender tucked into the nightdress. Maternal love didn't need words to be real. It lived in small mercies and the way a mother pretended to believe her daughter's new life would be easier than her own. Years later, that same daughter, now older, would do the same for her own child. The pattern repeating like embroidery, delicate, enduring, unspoken. She would teach silence the way one teaches grace, not out of malice, but memory. And the world would go on thinking this restraint was elegance, never realizing it was survival all along. The kitchen is warm, smelling of coal, onions, and soap. Morning light filters through grimy windows, turning the air a hazy gold. You can almost hear the scrape of iron pots, the splash of water into basins, the hum of 100 small tasks. Down here, life moves faster, freer. Words are less polished, laughter less polite. And gossip, the lifeblood of Victorian households, flows as easily as steam from the stove. Servants knew everything. They saw the arrivals, the departures, the blushes, the silences. In a world built on secrecy, they were its keepers. The upstairs folk lived behind closed doors, but their linens and letters passed through other hands. The night's evidence, the wrinkled sheets, the candle burned too low, the faint scent of perfume, all arrived in the laundry by morning. To the staff, virtue had a schedule. They didn't gossip to be cruel. It was survival, a shared language of powerlessness. In whispers and winks, they reclaimed a bit of control over a world that called them invisible. The cook would raise an eyebrow, the housemaid would smirk. The butler, grave as a priest, would cough discreetly, but listen all the same. You can imagine the rhythm of it, the way stories traveled faster than fire through those narrow corridors. For a newlywed bride, this invisible audience was both terrifying and inevitable. Her reputation didn't depend on truth, only on the stories others told. A blush seen at breakfast might become proof of passion, a quiet look, evidence of misery. The servants' gossip could raise or ruin her long before she learned their names. In grander homes, gossip became theatre. Maids compared notes about who had taken to married life gracefully, who seemed too aloof, who was already pale with regret. There was an art to their speculation, half fact, half invention. The house breathed with it, like lungs full of shared curiosity. Even silence upstairs was interpreted. In Victorian England, quiet was never neutral. But gossip wasn't always unkind. Sometimes it softened the world's harshness, offering humour where none belonged. A whispered joke, a shared laugh about some pompous guest or impractical gown. In those small exchanges, servants found companionship, even joy. Their mockery was gentle rebellion, proof that they still saw the absurdity in the rituals above them. Of course, some rumours escaped the kitchen. A careless remark, a curious guest, a cousin too fond of intrigue. Soon the tale would flutter through drawing rooms like a moth drawn to gaslight. Reputations dimmed faster than candles, and for a woman, especially a new wife, rumour was a ghost that never stopped knocking. To protect herself, she learned discretion as armour. She lowered her voice, managed her expression, smiled just enough to seem happy but never indulgent. Every gesture was a negotiation between privacy and performance. You can feel how tiring that must have been, to live aware of unseen witnesses in every hallway. Yet, strangely, she also depended on them. The same servants who whispered her name also kept her secrets. They shielded her from embarrassment, delivered letters discreetly, covered for small absences. Gossip was a form of intimacy, the dangerous kind that both binds and threatens. As night fell again, the laughter below stairs would fade into the clatter of dishes and the hum of the fire. The bride, far above, would lie awake, faintly aware of that other world beneath her feet, the one that watched, judged, and sometimes, silently, cared. And in that strange hierarchy of secrecy, every story found its place, polished upstairs, whispered downstairs, true nowhere entirely. The candlelight trembles across the sheets, revealing folds and creases like topography, a map of everything unsaid. You can almost hear the faint crackle of the fire dying low, the soft sigh of the mattress settling. The bed, so often romanticized, was in truth a theatre of contradictions. It was where tenderness met expectation, where love performed duty, and where silence often shouted the loudest. Victorian marriages were choreographed affairs. The bed wasn't only for sleep or affection. It was a stage where roles were rehearsed nightly. The husband entered as master, the wife as grace embodied. Yet, behind every gentle word and polite gesture, there was tension, the struggle between submission and selfhood. The bed was both comfort and cage. Furniture makers in the 1800s treated beds like monuments. Heavy mahogany frames, towering posts, embroidered canopies. They were designed to impress guests, not cradle affection. You can imagine lying beneath all that grandeur, feeling dwarfed by the weight of status itself. Even in rest, the Victorian couple was performing. The bed's beauty was public, its truth private. For many women, the marital bed carried more fear than rest. Its fine linens and perfumed pillows could not soften the truth of expectation. A man's desire was duty, a woman's response obedience. Passion wasn't forbidden, but it was scripted, its timing, its tone, its limits. You can almost feel the exhaustion of performing devotion without permission to feel it freely, and yet the bed could also become a site of quiet rebellion. A wife might feign sleep, or illness, or delicate nerves. She might insist the doctor-advised rest, turning medical excuse into shield. These small evasions were acts of control, ways to reclaim the body within the boundaries of decorum. Her stillness was not surrender, it was strategy. Doctors, of course, prescribed intimacy as a cure for female melancholy. If a woman seemed withdrawn, they suggested more marital attention, as if the solution to silence was insistence. Men, instructed by these same experts, mistook compliance for wellness. The absurdity of it hums like a faint vibration beneath the lace and linen. The bed also bore witness to tenderness, rare but real. Not every union was cold. Some couples, despite all odds, learned each other's rhythms, found laughter amid restraint. Their love grew quietly, unrecorded by etiquette books. In those rare moments, the bed stopped being a symbol and became simply human, a warm place where fear briefly melted. But when affection failed, resentment took its place. Many women lay awake beside snoring husbands, staring at the canopy's dark folds, listening to their own thoughts rattle like loose beads in a drawer. To them, the bed was a nightly reminder of choices made for them. And still, they smiled at breakfast, poured the tea, and straightened the napkins. That, too, was survival. The Victorian bed, for all its polish, was an archive of human contradictions. Love and resentment, hope and duty, comfort and exhaustion, all pressed into the same sheath. You can almost feel the echoes there still, trapped in the fibers of lace, long yellowed with time. Outside, the world moved forward, inventing telegraphs and locomotives, conquering continents. But in countless dimly lit bedrooms, progress stopped at the bedside. The empire could expand endlessly, yet the boundaries of a woman's night remained fixed, marked by candlelight, silence, and the steady weight of another's expectations. And so the bed remained, the most honest and dishonest piece of furniture in the Victorian home, a monument to propriety, a vessel for secrets, and a silent witness to the slow wars waged in whispers. The air is thick with the scent of candle wax and rosewater. You can almost hear the faint hum of the city outside, muffled by distance and drapery. Inside this small, glowing room, everything slows. The way a hand moves, the brush of fabric against skin. These things suddenly speak louder than words. In the Victorian world, touch was its own forbidden dialect, learned in secret and never spoken aloud. For most women, physical affection had been rehearsed only through imagination. A hand offered during a dance, a gloved finger grazing another in passing. These were the only acceptable preludes. To touch without permission was scandal. To desire touch was sin. And yet, beneath the starched manners and prayer book morality, the human body kept whispering what the tongue could not. Every gesture carried consequence. A husband's hand resting too firmly might seem possessive, too gently, indifferent. A wife's flinch could be read as modesty or rejection, her stillness as submission or fear. You can almost feel how carefully each breath was measured, how intimacy became performance, and performance became survival. The etiquette books warned women not to initiate affection. A lady's touch should be passive, they said, lest she seem immodest. What an odd rule, that tenderness itself could be misread as disobedience. The body was meant to react, not to reach. You can sense how that passivity hollowed the soul, turning warmth into duty, longing into silence. Still, some found ways to communicate through subtler forms. The brushing of sleeves, the passing of a cup, the faint pressure of fingertips while exchanging a letter. Moments so brief they might not even register, but they meant everything. For those who lived surrounded by rules, small touches became rebellions. Lovers who could not speak freely learned to touch with restraint so precise it bordered on poetry. A hand that lingered half a second longer than necessary could rewrite an entire relationship. It's remarkable how the smallest human gesture, forbidden by propriety, became sacred through scarcity. For the newlywed wife, touch was both discovery and dread. She learned its meanings not from teachers but from experience, and often from mistakes. A touch could soothe or frighten, heal or humiliate. It depended entirely on intention, yet intention was rarely discussed. How many misunderstandings were born from that silence? You can almost feel them accumulating like invisible bruises. And yet, amid that confusion, tenderness sometimes bloomed. A husband adjusting a shawl, tucking a loose strand of hair, resting his hand softly over hers. Acts so ordinary they might seem trivial, yet to her they meant safety. In a world that demanded stillness, to be touched gently was to be seen. Some women recorded these small mercies in private diaries. He brushed my cheek and did not expect words. One wrote. Another. I fear the nights less when his hand is kind. Such sentences, fragile as moth wings, tell us everything about their hunger for gentleness, a hunger so carefully hidden it barely had a name. Touch, in the Victorian age, was not only about pleasure, it was about permission. Who could give it, who could receive it, and when? That invisible contract turned the simplest acts into moral puzzles. And still, despite the laws, despite the sermons, human nature kept reaching out, again and again, for warmth. By the time the candle burned to its final inch, the room would be filled not with scandal, but with something quieter. Two people trying, imperfectly, to bridge the distance their world had built between them. And though history forgets their names, that fragile, wordless effort was perhaps the most honest language ever spoken in the Victorian home. The morning light sneaks through the lace curtains, turning the air pale and dusty. You can almost hear the faint chime of a clock somewhere downstairs, each tick neat and self-contained, the sound of a world obsessed with control. In that rhythm, a woman's modesty was not simply admired, it was engineered. Every gesture, every glance, every hemline existed to prove she was properly contained. To the Victorians, modesty was a kind of architecture. It built invisible walls around the female body, layers of fabric, posture, and silence. A woman's reputation could survive poverty, but not exposure. To be modest was to be safe, respectable, and worthy of protection. Yet, like any cage disguised as a virtue, it kept her still while men moved freely beyond it. The word itself carried weight. Modesty sounded gentle, but it hid sharp edges. It told women how to sit, how to breathe, how to speak. Even laughter had to be modest, soft, melodic, never too bold. You can imagine the exhaustion of living under such scrutiny, where even joy required choreography. A bride's modesty was her most prized possession. She was expected to carry it like a torch through her wedding, through her first night, through every interaction thereafter. To lose it, or even appear to, was social death. And so, many learned to hide beneath layers of politeness, perfect smiles concealing storms of thought. You can almost feel that tension coiling beneath her calm. Fashion itself conspired with morality. Dresses were designed to restrict, high collars, long sleeves, dozens of buttons impossible to undo alone. The corset wasn't just a garment, it was philosophy stitched in whalebone. To be laced tightly was to be virtuous. The irony is thick. The same culture that praised delicacy demanded endurance worthy of soldiers. Men praised modesty as if it were affection. "You are so pure," they'd say, meaning pliable, "so reserved," meaning silent. Compliments carried expectations. Admiration was instruction in disguise. Every word that idealized her also erased her. You can hear the contradiction humming softly through time, praise that sounded like a lullaby but felt like a lock clicking shut. There were women who tried to redefine the term. Poets, painters, thinkers who claimed that true modesty came from self-knowledge, not concealment. Their ideas were radical: to be modest because you understood your worth, not because you hid it. But such words rarely left the drawing rooms of progressive circles. Society preferred modesty it could measure by fabric and compliance. For most, the performance became second nature. They blushed on cue, looked down when addressed, laughed just enough to seem pleasant, but never confident. The reflex was survival disguised as virtue. Even alone, many women found themselves moving carefully, modesty lingering like perfume, even with no one to impress. And yet, there was quiet rebellion in restraint. A woman who mastered modesty could also weaponize it. By appearing harmless, she could observe freely, gather knowledge, outmaneuver assumptions. Her stillness made her invisible, and invisibility, in a rigid world, was freedom's camouflage. History often forgets how strategic silence can be. So when you picture her now, seated at her vanity, brushing her hair 100 times before bed, remember that modesty was both burden and mask. It demanded sacrifice, but it also gave her a kind of power no one intended. Beneath the lace and lowered gaze, she carried a mind sharper than any corset's edge. And though she never spoke rebellion aloud, her endurance itself became defiance, the quiet protest of simply continuing to breathe in a world that preferred her breathless. The mirror stands tall, its surface faintly clouded by age. You can almost see her reflection. The young wife, buttoning her sleeves, adjusting her hair, looking at herself as though studying a stranger. The morning light catches her features softly, but her gaze feels distant. She's not admiring beauty, she's taking inventory. In the Victorian world, a woman's body didn't belong entirely to her. It was something to maintain, to display, and most quietly of all, to surrender. Marriage transformed ownership. Before the ceremony, she was her father's responsibility, afterward, her husband's possession. The law made it explicit. Under coverture, her legal identity merged with his. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even claim her own wages. Her body, too, was absorbed into that union, not symbolically, but literally. What he owned by law, she lived within. Even the language of affection revealed this truth. My wife sounded tender, but the grammar carried centuries of entitlement. She was his, linguistically, legally, economically. Society called that love. You can feel the chill in the realization. How an embrace could double as enclosure. Etiquette manuals reminded women that submission in all things domestic and personal was a wifely virtue. It sounded poetic, even holy, until you understood what it meant. That her comfort, her boundaries, even her pain, were secondary to the sanctity of obedience. The very vows that promised protection also demanded surrender. In public, her body was pedestal and portrait. She was expected to walk gracefully, to carry herself like proof of her husband's refinement. Her health was his reputation, her demeanor his success. A faintness at church, a blush at dinner, all became social currency, traded quietly among watchful eyes. You can almost feel how exhausting it was to be always visible, never truly seen. In private, the rules were even stricter. The conjugal rights of husbands were protected by law. A wife's refusal was not recognized as possibility. Affection was presumed, consent irrelevant. The irony is brutal. A society that idolized chastity also institutionalized its violation. This was not cruelty in their eyes. It was marriage fulfilling itself. Doctors and priests alike reinforced the idea that a woman's duty was to please and to bear. To deny intimacy was to risk divine disappointment. Even pain was reframed as virtue. The gentle suffering of womanhood, they called it. You can hear how politeness turns cruelty into poetry. Yet, even within this cage, women found small rebellions. Some used illness as shield. The nerves, the vapors, a weak constitution. Feigned fragility became their only language of refusal. Others turned to literature and letters, carving out mental spaces the law couldn't touch. The mind, unlike the body, remained hers alone, invisible, ungoverned, free. There were exceptions. Rare men who saw their wives as partners, not possessions. For them, intimacy was conversation, not conquest. Their stories, quieter and less recorded, prove that humanity persisted even within systems built to suppress it. Love, it seems, always finds a way to sneak through cracks in the marble. Still, for most women, the reflection in the mirror never fully belonged to them again. The dress, the jewelry, the house, the very air of their existence bore someone else's name. You can almost feel her looking at herself now, uncertain where she ends and he begins. The world calls it unity. She knows it feels like disappearance. Outside, a horse clatters down the street, the world continuing its indifferent routine. But in that silent room, beneath the weight of lace and law, stands a woman learning a painful truth. that ownership and love were never meant to share the same bed. And yet, in her world, they always did. The room smells faintly of lavender water and dust, the kind that gathers quietly on silk and secrets. Morning sun filters through gauzy curtains, turning the air pale and forgiving. She sits by the window, still wearing the faint stiffness of yesterday. The city outside hums with ordinary life, the clop of hooves, a vendor's call, the rustle of newspapers, but inside the air holds its breath. Innocence, that prized possession of every Victorian bride, has finally changed owners. Society worshipped purity with the zeal of religion. It was the cornerstone of a woman's worth, the proof of upbringing, the promise of obedience. From birth, she was taught that her innocence was fragile, a snowflake that could melt at a glance, a pearl that could be stolen with a whisper. And so she learned to guard it not only from others, but from herself. To feel curiosity was already to sin. The irony, of course, is that innocence was valuable only until it was gone, the very act that society demanded of her. Marriage, consummation, submission, destroyed the virtue that made her desirable. It was a transaction wrapped in lace. Once given, it could never be renewed. You can almost feel the cruel arithmetic of it, the way worth turned into memory overnight. Men were praised for experience. Women were purified by ignorance. This imbalance was as natural to them as the seasons. A man's past was character. A woman's was stain. Even the language betrayed her. She was deflowered, as though beauty was something that wilted at touch. The word itself feels heavy, designed to sound poetic enough to hide its violence. Innocence was marketed as beauty, too. Painters adored pale skin, downcast eyes, and hesitant smiles. The visual grammar of chastity. Girls practiced modest expressions before mirrors, learning to look unaware of their own faces. To be innocent was to exist as an object of admiration, never awareness. You can almost see her reflection now. Perfect, empty, priceless. Mothers and governesses taught this performance with precision. A blush must bloom on cue, a voice must tremble in just the right octave. To fail at innocence was to fail at womanhood. The skill of appearing unknowing became survival itself. But what happens when the act ends and reality begins? That's the question she faces now, sitting by the window, sunlight gilding her uncertainty. The first night stripped more than fabric. It stripped illusion. What she'd been told to fear, she met face to face. What she'd been told to hide, she could no longer deny existed. And yet, she is expected to rise the next morning serene, fulfilled, saintly, as though enlightenment were immediate, painless, divine. You can feel how heavy that expectation must have been, pressing gently but endlessly on her chest. Some women described that moment not as awakening, but as erasure. The innocence they lost wasn't purity, but freedom from knowing. They began to see the machinery behind the romance, how marriage, morality, and myth worked together to keep them docile. Knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. And so, innocence became the first casualty of understanding. Yet, not all loss is tragedy. Some discovered within that awakening a strange kind of clarity. Without the veil of ignorance, they could finally see themselves, flawed, frightened, real. The world that once adored their naivety now felt smaller, almost childish. In the quiet afterward, they began to rebuild, not as saints, but as survivors. Still, society insisted on pretending. Portraits were painted, novels written, sermons preached, all celebrating innocence as the most beautiful lie ever told. It kept order, appearances, and power neatly in place. But under every corseted breath, women carried the truth. Innocence was never theirs to protect. It was the world's illusion to consume. And so she sits by the window, watching sunlight spill across her wedding ring, her reflection, her world. She is no longer innocent, perhaps, but she is awake. And in the long hush of that realization, something deeper stirs. The beginning of wisdom, quiet and irreversible. The night hums differently now. You can almost feel it. The air warmer, the candlelight deeper, the pulse in the room slower but alive, the sound of fabric shifting, of quiet breath, of thoughts louder than words. For centuries, desire was the ghost haunting every Victorian parlour, always present, never acknowledged. A whisper behind sermons, a flicker in the novels hidden beneath the bed. Everyone knew it existed, but naming it was unthinkable. Desire, to Victorians, was both disease and divinity. For men, it was vigour, proof of life and masculinity. For women, it was shame, something to be endured, cured, or denied. Medical journals of the era described female passion as hysteria of the womb, recommending cold baths and moral restraint. You can almost hear the absurdity of it. The same culture that demanded attraction also pathologized its existence. Yet, the human body never reads the etiquette manuals. Beneath layers of silk and scripture, it still remembers warmth. It still responds to nearness, to scent, to voice. The heartbeat does not care for social class or sermons. It is the great equalizer, thudding quietly beneath lace and linen, reminding every soul, no matter how refined, that they are still made of need. Victorian women were taught to fear their own senses. A flushed cheek was a betrayal, a sigh, a confession. Desire had to be disguised as faintness, affection translated into duty, but repression only sharpened awareness. You can imagine how electric a simple touch became in that silence, how a glance across a dinner table could feel indecent, how the brush of fingers could ignite an entire world. Writers of the age found ways to say what society would not. Passion hid in poetry, in metaphors of storms, tides, fever, and flowers. Emily Dickinson called it wild nights. Bronte cloaked it in thunder and moors. These women smuggled truth through language, teaching readers to read between the silences. Words became the safe house of desire. For most wives, though reality was quieter, their desire, when it stirred, arrived like an intruder, sudden, confusing, unwelcome. They had been told to wait, to receive, to obey. No one had prepared them for wanting, and yet, when it came, it made the world sharper, colours deeper, breath slower, sleep impossible. You can almost feel her lying awake, startled by her own pulse. Religion complicated it further. Preachers warned that lust was a sin, yet marriage demanded it. A woman was to inflame her husband's affection without kindling her own. The contradiction left her stranded between purity and pleasure, both praised and punished. Even in prayer, she might feel shame for sensations she did not summon. Her body became both altar and confession booth. Desire could, however, become liberation. When met with gentleness, with trust, not domination, it taught women that pleasure wasn't corruption, but communication. The body, finally heard, spoke in its native language, touch, warmth, size, heartbeat. For a moment, it transcended the cage of propriety. That, perhaps, was the true danger to Victorian order, a woman who felt without fear. Some women, brave in their diaries, dared to describe it. "I discovered something beautiful," one wrote, "and it frightened me more than sin." That single sentence captures the paradox perfectly. How joy, when forbidden, feels like defiance. You can sense the tremor of awe in those words, like someone describing fire for the first time. By morning, of course, the world returned. The dresses were buttoned, the hair pinned, the smiles restored. But inside, something remained awake. Desire, once named, never forgets its name. It hides, perhaps, but it hums on, soft and patient, beneath the lace of obedience, waiting for another night, when silence feels safe enough to breathe again. The candle burns lower now, its flame bowing like a weary dancer. You can almost hear the faint hiss of melting wax, the slow tick of the clock beyond the door. The room is warm, but not tender. This is not a place of fairy tales or poetry. It's the stage where love must prove itself useful. For the Victorian woman, love was less an emotion than an expectation, carefully arranged like flowers that must never wilt. Romantic novels of the time painted love as destiny, a spiritual bond that transcended flesh. But reality was far less lyrical. Love was often the last thing considered in a marriage. Wealth, reputation, and class came first. If affection followed, it was seen as blessing. If not, endurance would suffice. You can almost hear the hollow echo of those vows, sincerity diluted by necessity. The bed was where myth and fact collided. Newlyweds learned quickly that marriage did not guarantee harmony. The body could obey vows, but the heart was slower, more rebellious. Many women discovered on their wedding night that love, like faith, could not be commanded. It needed cultivation, time, gentleness, patience, qualities the world rarely granted them. For husbands, affection was proof of ownership. A loving wife was obedient, attentive, grateful. For wives, affection was often work. Emotional labor performed quietly, without applause. She learned to soothe his temper, anticipate his moods, celebrate his triumphs. The myth of love demanded devotion even when tenderness was absent. You can feel how heavy that must have been to give warmth into a void and call it virtue. Yet some couples, against all odds, found something genuine. Love did exist, though not as society described it. It was less thunder and more endurance. Small gestures, shared jokes, the rare feeling of being understood. A husband who poured tea instead of commanding it. A wife who dared to speak honestly. Their affection grew like moss, quiet, persistent, unglamorous, but alive. Still, the myth endured. Poets wrote of burning devotion. Artists painted glowing brides bathed in candlelight. The truth was simpler and lonelier. Love, as preached, was impossible. Love, as practiced, was survival. The difference between the two was where disillusionment lived. You can almost feel her learning that distinction now, lying in the half-dark, staring at the ceiling's carved roses. In society's eyes, her marriage would be called happy as long as it looked proper. Happiness was measured in appearances, the brightness of a dress, the politeness of her tone, the frequency of her smiles. Whether her heart slept or ached beneath that perfection was irrelevant. Respectability was the performance, love, the illusion that kept it believable. But illusions can be kind. They soften the edges of endurance, make repetition bearable. Some women clung to the myth of love, not out of ignorance, but necessity. To believe she was cherished was to survive the days when she felt invisible. Even lies, when wrapped in comfort, can keep you warm. Over time, the marriage bed ceased to be battlefield or altar. It became a quiet truce. She learned to share space without surrendering thought, to give enough to maintain peace, to keep a small corner of her mind untouched, a secret room where no one else could enter. Love might have been myth, but self-awareness was real, and it was growing. Outside, rain begins to tap against the glass. Gentle, rhythmic, almost forgiving. You can imagine her turning toward the sound, letting its cadence fill the silence. The world beyond the window feels distant but honest. Nature has no myths, it simply is. And in that thought, perhaps, she finds a fragile comfort. That truth, even painful, is better than perfection built on lies. The room is quiet except for the faint hum of the fire and the distant murmur of the city beyond the fog. You can almost feel the air, dense with warmth, perfumed faintly by rose oil and old fabric. She sits still, her hands folded, the candle's glow catching the curve of her cheek. The night has left her thoughtful, not broken. Pain, she realizes, has many shapes, and not all of them cruel. Some arrive not to wound, but to teach. Victorian women were taught to bear pain gracefully. It was seen as proof of virtue, of moral strength. A woman's ability to endure childbirth, silence, rejection, even lovelessness, was celebrated as evidence of her worth. Patience, the preachers said, is the crown of womanhood. You can hear how soft those words sound and how sharp they truly are. The first nights of marriage often taught that lesson too soon. Bodies unaccustomed to closeness met with awkwardness, ignorance, sometimes violence disguised as affection. And yet, society called it natural. Pain was reframed as purity, discomfort became devotion. She was told to be still, to smile, to let endurance sanctify the act. In such moments, pain turned into ritual. But pain has memory. It lingers in muscle and mind, teaching what words cannot. It teaches fear, yes, but also awareness. Awareness of the body as something separate from expectation. For many women, that awareness became the first spark of identity. To know where you hurt is to know where you begin. You can almost feel that realization stirring quietly beneath her calm. Doctors, husbands, priests all spoke of female fragility. Yet, when confronted with the reality of pain, it was the women who remained standing. They birthed, healed, managed households, and carried unspoken grief without collapsing. The fragility was a myth invented by those who feared resilience. Pain, ironically, was their teacher, cruel but effective. Some women found ways to translate it into art, letters, and subtle rebellion. They wrote poetry in secret notebooks, painted while husbands were away, turned endurance into creation. Each brushstroke, each word, each thought unshared was an act of reclamation. Pain had made them quiet, but also observant. And observation is the seed of wisdom. Even physical pain, once expected and normalized, began to lose its holiness. The more women talked, privately, discreetly, dangerously, the more they realized it wasn't divine trial but design. That recognition was small, but radical. To name pain truthfully is the first step toward refusing it. You can sense the quiet revolution brewing, even if no one dares to call it that yet. Still, pain persisted, woven into corsets, pregnancies, silence. But within it grew endurance that no sermon could erase. The kind that does not shout, does not crumble, the kind that keeps living. For many Victorian wives, that resilience became the invisible foundation of every household. Men believed they ruled the home. In truth, women held it together through the quiet art of surviving their own aches. Sometimes, in the deep of night, she would touch the tender places, physical, emotional, and feel not weakness, but recognition. Each ache was a reminder she existed beyond duty, beyond decorum. Pain had introduced her to herself. And though she would never thank it, she understood it. That, too, is a kind of power. By dawn, she rises, dresses, and smiles for the world again. But something subtle has shifted. The lessons remain under her skin, silent as scars. She moves differently now, not softer, but steadier. The world may still see fragility. She knows better. Her endurance has become its own quiet rebellion, an unspoken vow that she will never let pain define her, only refine her. The church bells echo faintly through the morning fog, distant but insistent, like a reminder of promises she didn't fully understand when she made them. You can almost smell the damp stone of the chapel, the wax of the altar candles, the faint sweetness of lilies that linger long after the ceremony has ended. Marriage, in the Victorian world, was more than contract. It was creed. And every wife was both believer and offering. From the moment the veil was lifted, her life became liturgy. Every gesture, every word, every silence belonged to ritual. Her patience was prayer, her obedience, devotion. Even suffering carried the glow of sanctity. Religion didn't simply bless marriage. It defined it, carving its commandments into the very rhythm of domestic life. A virtuous wife, the pastors said, is a crown to her husband. You can hear the symmetry and the subtext. He rules, she adorns. The wedding vows themselves were sermons in miniature, to love, honor, and obey. The final word, obey, carried the weight of centuries. It turned affection into hierarchy, and hierarchy into holiness. A woman's humility became her sacrament. To question her husband's will was to question divine order. God, man, woman, an unbroken chain of authority wrapped in velvet. She had been raised to find comfort in that order. Faith promised meaning, and meaning softened submission. Endure, the scripture whispered, and you will be rewarded. So she endured through loneliness, exhaustion, and unspoken pain, believing heaven would balance the scales. The cross she carried was carved from domestic wood. Priests often preached that marriage purified women. It gave them purpose beyond vanity, protected them from temptation, sanctified their bodies through service. The irony, of course, is that the same doctrine that claimed to exalt her also erased her, turning her virtue into a mirror for someone else's reflection. You can almost feel the stillness of that kind of worship, where silence is the holiest sound. Some women found genuine peace in faith, not in submission, but in surrender to something larger than fear. Prayer became the only space where they could speak freely, even if only to themselves.
Kneeling in the candlelit quiet, they whispered truths no confession box could hold, their doubts, their longing, their quiet exhaustion. Religion, when stripped of authority, still offered solace. Others, though, began to see the cracks. They noticed how the sermons always favored endurance over equality, forgiveness over fairness. They wondered why God's voice so often sounded like a husband's.
Some dared to ask in diaries and private letters whether faith could exist without servitude. Those questions didn't make them heretics, they made them awake. Still, the rituals continued. Sunday services, family prayers, the endless cycle of repentance and restraint. The domestic sphere became her monastery, walls draped in lace instead of stone. She was expected to keep the faith not just for herself, but for her husband, her children, her servants. Religion became duty scented with rosewater, and yet, beneath that polished devotion, something deeper stirred, a quiet understanding that holiness did not require obedience, that grace could coexist with defiance. The sacred, she began to realize, lived not in submission but in compassion of the kind she gave endlessly, often without receiving it back. So she prayed, still. But her prayers changed. They were no longer for endurance, but for clarity. Not for strength to obey, but for courage to exist. In that evolution, faith became her own again, quiet, personal, ungoverned. And in that flickering candlelight, you can almost see her smile, small, private, radiant. For the first time, she is both believer and creator of her own creed. The afternoon light lies flat across the parlor, turning the wallpaper's roses into faded ghosts. The clock ticks too loudly. The house smells faintly of polish and dust. You can almost hear the creak of her chair as she shifts, careful not to wrinkle the silk. Everything here is proper, symmetrical, calm, and yet, beneath that stillness, something hollow hums. Respectability, in the Victorian world, was both armor and isolation. She has everything a woman could want, or so they say. A fine home, a ring that gleams in every gesture, servants who bow and smile. Her letters are written on thick cream paper, her gowns rustle like confidence. But possessions have a strange way of echoing when no one answers back. Respectability demands perfection, and perfection is the quietest kind of prison. Visitors come often, ladies from neighboring streets, carrying parasols and politeness. They speak in delicate code of weather, of husbands, of illnesses, politely endured. Never of fear, never of longing. Conversation is choreography. No one ever stumbles. You can imagine her smiling, nodding, participating, all the while sensing that none of them truly say anything. At social dinners, she glows under candlelight, laughing on cue, her words measured like teaspoons of sugar. The illusion must hold. A respectable woman's face is a performance rehearsed until it looks natural. But when the guests leave and the silver is polished, she returns to silence, her truest companion. Loneliness was not considered tragedy, it was elegance. Solitude proved discipline. To complain of it was ungrateful, even indecent. Society taught her to confuse isolation with dignity, to believe that silence meant satisfaction. You can feel how that confusion settled in her bones, how she learned to smile with her eyes dimmed, just enough to seem serene. Her husband, absorbed in business and reputation, seldom noticed. He saw composure as contentment, quiet as grace. And so her loneliness became invisible, an emotion so refined it no longer looked like pain. Even sadness was expected to behave. Letters from real women of the era reveal this truth in their gentlest lines. "We dine often," one wrote, "and I am very happy, I think." That final phrase, I think, is a masterpiece of restraint. It carries both the performance and the fracture. So much of the Victorian feminine voice lives in that hesitation. Sometimes she escapes the drawing room and walks alone through the garden. The air smells of rain and soil, alive, unpolished. For a moment, the world stops watching. She breathes differently, deeper, freer. Out here, the rules loosen slightly, and loneliness turns to reflection. Even isolation, when unobserved, can bloom into thought. By twilight, she returns indoors, smoothing her dress, preparing for another evening of poise. The loneliness slips back on as naturally as her jewelry, familiar, shining, quiet. But it has changed. She knows it now for what it is, not failure, not punishment, but proof that her soul still wants something more than perfection. And as the gas lamps flicker to life across London's endless streets, you can almost feel her standing by the window, looking out. One respectable woman among thousands, each confined in their polished cages, each waiting for a reason to breathe deeply again. The mirror glows faintly in candlelight, its surface blurred with warmth and shadow. She stands before it, adjusting the folds of her gown, practicing the expression the world expects to see. You can almost hear the rustle of fabric, the soft click of jewelry, the measured inhale that steadies her smile. Pretending, for a Victorian woman, wasn't deceit. It was endurance, polished to perfection. From childhood, she was taught to perform composure, to cry quietly, to thank quickly, to never reveal too much joy or sorrow. Emotion, like skin, was meant to stay covered. The face was a mask of civility, painted not with powder, but with control. Even the word ladylike implied theatre, a performance of gentleness rehearsed in private and judged in public. Marriage only refined that skill. A wife's ability to pretend, to smooth over her husband's temper, to feign contentment, to maintain grace amid boredom, was praised as maturity. Love might falter, but appearances could not. In this way, respectability became choreography. Every glance, every silence, every sigh performed with invisible precision. The house itself played along. The portraits on the walls smiled permanently, their painted eyes serene. The silver gleamed as if nothing ever tarnished. Even the piano in the corner, rarely touched, waited like a prop in a well-maintained illusion. You can almost feel how heavy that stillness becomes when one must live inside it every day. Servants, friends, even family participated in the same quiet conspiracy. Everyone pretended that everything was fine. To admit otherwise was to fracture the delicate web that kept society spinning. Reality, no matter how sharp, was always wrapped in velvet. A lady didn't confess unhappiness. She hosted luncheons. She didn't question morality. She arranged flowers. The world rewarded her for pretending well. And yet, there was artistry in it. Pretending required observation, intelligence, discipline. It demanded emotional fluency, the ability to translate pain into grace, weariness into charm. Beneath the surface, women became masters of nuance. The tilt of a head, the pause before a reply, entire stories lived in those small gestures. Sometimes, though, the mask slipped. A glance held too long, a sigh too deep. The cracks would show, and someone, a friend, a maid, a stranger, would notice. For a fleeting moment, honesty breathed through the performance. It never lasted. But those moments, rare and unspoken, felt like oxygen. You can almost feel her craving them. Those seconds of being real before the curtain fell again. Writers of the age captured this tension with brutal clarity. Jane Austen, the Brontes, George Eliot, all wrote women who smiled while unraveling inside. Their heroines weren't rebels with swords, but rebels with silence. They pretended outwardly to survive inwardly. Fiction became confession disguised as decorum. In time, pretending became second nature, less deception, more reflex. She might not even remember who she was beneath it all, and yet, paradoxically, that awareness, that faint ache beneath the mask, proved she still had a self to hide. Only the living feel the weight of pretending, so she keeps smiling, keeps hosting, keeps moving through the dance of civility. But each night, when the house finally sleeps, she removes the pins from her hair and looks at herself in the dim glass. No audience, no applause. Just breath, just being. In that reflection, honest and unadorned, she meets the person the world will never know, and for a heartbeat, that truth feels like freedom. The room smells faintly of ink and candle soot. You can almost hear the quiet scratch of a quill on thick paper, the whisper of breath between sentences. She writes slowly, carefully, listening for footsteps in the corridor. Every word is weighed not only for meaning, but for risk. In the age of propriety, a letter was both rebellion and confession, the only place where truth could live safely, even if only for a few hours. Victorian women wrote in layers, politeness on the surface, pulse beneath. The first lines spoke of weather, health, or recent calls. But beneath the lace of small talk, something trembled. Desire, fatigue, frustration, hope. It was an art form, this coded honesty. The right phrase, the right hesitation could say everything without saying anything. Paper carried freedom the tongue could not. When she wrote, she could think aloud without fear of judgment. The ink became her voice, unbroken by interruption. A letter was a mirror that answered back. You can almost feel her shoulders loosen as she writes, the tightness in her chest easing with each word. Sometimes the letters were to friends, confidants who understood the unspoken grammar of discontent. "I am well," she might write, meaning, "I am barely breathing." "He is kind," might mean, "He does not see me." Women learned to read each other through these elegant fictions. Friendship, disguised as correspondence, became their only sanctuary. Others wrote to men who were not their husbands, not for scandal, but for understanding. A poet, a teacher, an old acquaintance, someone who listened without condescension. These exchanges rarely crossed into physical betrayal, yet society would have condemned them all the same. Thought itself was infidelity. You can feel how precious, how dangerous those sentences must have felt beneath the trembling flame. The postal service, booming in the 19th century, became the great accomplice. Letters slipped quietly into red boxes on foggy corners, carried by gloved hands through the waking city. Thousands of secrets passed each day, disguised as polite correspondence. The streets themselves became veins of confession. Some letters were never sent. They filled drawers, boxes, and hidden compartments, little tombs of unsaid truth. The act of writing was enough. Ink turned pain into permanence, and permanence made it bearable. Many of these were burned later by cautious hands or dutiful servants. Yet even ashes keep memory. You can almost smell the faint sweetness of burned paper lingering in the air. For women forbidden to speak openly, writing was prayer in disguise. Every sentence was a plea for witness. See me, hear me, believe that I exist beyond the role I play. The power of such quiet defiance cannot be overstated. Empires have been shaken by smaller truths. A few of these letters survive today, tucked in museums, sold at auctions, faded to sepia. Their ink trembles still, as though the emotions beneath never fully died. Reading them feels like eavesdropping on souls who refused to vanish. You realize they were not weak nor naive. They were merely born in a century that feared female honesty. And so she writes her final line, signs her name, perhaps her real one, perhaps not. The candle flickers. The wax pools. She folds the letter, presses it to her lips for luck, and seals it shut. The sound of the wax cooling is small, but profound. The sound of truth choosing its disguise. Tomorrow she will smile again, speak softly, and move through her world unchanged. But somewhere in a drawer lies her real voice, inked, fragile, unrepentant. And that, perhaps, is the closest thing to freedom her world will ever let her keep. The rain has stopped, but the air still glistens, heavy with the scent of wet stone and smoke. You can almost hear the soft drip of water from the eaves outside, the sigh of the city exhaling after a long night. Inside, she stands by the window, one hand resting on the sill, her reflection framed by the glass. The candle behind her burns low, its flame tired but steady, like her. Something in her gaze has changed. It's no longer wonder or fear. It's awareness. Victorian rebellion didn't begin with riots or speeches. It began in drawing rooms, in diaries, in private thoughts that refused to stay small. A wife reading a forbidden book, a mother choosing silence over apology, a servant deciding not to lower her eyes. Each act, invisible to history, was a rebellion measured in breaths, not banners. The revolution was quiet, but it was constant. For her, rebellion started with refusal to pretend that obedience and happiness were the same. She still smiled, still curtsied, still poured the tea. But something inside refused to kneel. The mind, once awakened, cannot unlearn its own freedom. You can almost feel it unfolding within her. Delicate, deliberate, irreversible. Books became her allies. Hidden beneath needlework or behind hymnals, they offered escape. Mary Wollstonecraft, George Eliot, Charlotte Bronte. Voices that whispered, "You are not alone." Their words didn't shout, they resonated. Each page widened her world just a little more. She began to see herself not as ornament, but as mind, a thought among thoughts. Even conversation became weapon. A well-placed question at dinner, a raised eyebrow during a sermon. Small gestures that challenged the script. Most didn't notice. Those who did pretended not to. That was how rebellion survived, disguised as grace. Society could not punish what it refused to see. Some women joined charitable causes or educational circles, cloaking activism in philanthropy. Helping the poor was safe, helping themselves was scandalous. Yet, through teaching, organizing, reading, they planted seeds that would bloom decades later. The suffragists of the next century were watered by these quiet, anonymous hands. In her private moments, rebellion was simpler still. It was thought unmonitored, unsupervised, unrepentant. When she looked in the mirror now, she didn't see property or virtue. She saw potential. The word was dangerous, intoxicating. Potential meant possibility, and possibility meant change. You can almost sense the thrill and terror of that realization flickering behind her calm eyes. Even her prayers changed. They became conversations, not confessions. She no longer asked for endurance. She asked for understanding. She no longer sought forgiveness. She sought meaning. Faith, once shaped by obedience, began to reshape itself around her humanity. In that shift, rebellion found its soul. Outside, London moves on, carriages, gas lamps, the endless hum of empire. Inside, the world feels different. The same walls that once confined her now echo with a strange lightness. Nothing material has changed, yet everything has. Awareness, once born, alters the shape of air, and so she breathes deeply, deliberately, for what feels like the first time. No manifestos, no revolutions, just breath, steady and sure. The rebellion of existence, the radical act of remaining herself in a world built to erase her. Tomorrow she will rise again, pour the tea, answer politely, and smile when spoken to. But beneath that smile lives a truth stronger than any law or sermon, that she has seen her own reflection clearly, and that, quietly, she will never bow to it again. The house is quiet now. You can almost feel the stillness, that thick, tender kind that hums beneath the walls after the world has finished speaking. The fire in the grate has shrunk to a faint glow, casting soft amber veins across the rug. Somewhere upstairs a clock counts the seconds slowly, as though time itself has grown drowsy. Every creak of the wood feels alive, familiar. This is the hour when the house belongs to memory. She walks softly through the corridor, her hand trailing along the wallpaper. The pattern is faintly raised, lilies curling upward, touched by dust and shadow. Beneath her fingertips, the paper feels warm, as if the day's conversations still linger there. She pauses by the door where the light spills out faintly from under the frame. Her reflection in the doorknob is small, distorted, almost childlike. For a moment, she smiles at her own quietness. In the still air, scents hang longer. The faint sweetness of beeswax, the ghost of perfume, the earthy note of extinguished fire. The house seems to breathe, exhaling the fatigue of its inhabitants, inhaling the silence they've left behind. You can almost hear that rhythm, slow and steady, like a cradle rocking itself to sleep. Every room holds a fragment of story. The chair where she once waited, the mirror that saw too much, the bed where thoughts once tangled like ribbons. None of it feels heavy now. The house, emptied of performance, returns to truth. It is only wood, fabric, and air. And in that simplicity, there's peace. When she finally turns off the last candle, the darkness isn't frightening. It's soft, like velvet drawn gently across the skin. The kind of darkness that doesn't erase, but soothes. You can feel her breathing deepen, her shoulders fall. Even the night itself seems to exhale, folding her gently into its rhythm. Touch remains long after the moment ends. It lingers not on skin, but in the quiet between thoughts. A warmth remembered, a texture half forgotten. You can almost sense it now, the ghost of a hand that once brushed against hers, the shape of comfort rather than its presence. Time dulls most sensations, but touch leaves an echo. In the dim light, she traces her own wrist with her fingertips, testing the shape of solitude. The skin is cooler now, but still alive, still capable of remembering. Every scar, every softness is a record of endurance. The body, more honest than memory, tells its story in silence. She thinks of the people who have touched her life, some gently, some carelessly, some without ever knowing how deeply they left their mark. The mind replays these small gestures like prayers, a hand offering a teacup, a mother adjusting a collar, a friend brushing away dust, each one proof that she existed in the world, that she was seen. Touch is the first language we ever learn and the last we ever forget. It asks for nothing, promises little, yet carries everything. Even now, as the house sleeps, the air itself seems to cradle her, soft, invisible, constant. You can almost feel it pressing lightly against her skin, a reminder that presence doesn't always require contact. She exhales slowly, and the room exhales with her. The memory of touch fades into warmth, and the warmth into rest. The heart, for once, feels unguarded. And in that gentle surrender, she finds what the world never taught her to name: ease. Dreams come quietly in old houses. They slide under doors, drift down hallways, find the sleepers who forgot to lock them out. You can almost hear them, faint as feathers, deliberate as thought. Tonight, they find her easily. The day has left her tender, open, ready to be carried. She dreams not of the past, but of versions of herself, the girl she was, the woman she became, the stranger she might still turn into. They meet in some endless meadow that smells of rain and lilac. None of them speak, yet they all understand. In dreams, language finally rests. Time behaves differently here. The young version of her runs barefoot through wet grass, laughing. The older one watches, smiling, hands clasped calmly. Between them, the air shimmers as though forgiveness itself has texture. You can feel it, that strange, weightless acceptance that dreams offer so easily and waking life so rarely does. In this dream, the corset unlaces itself, the curtains billow wide, the ring melts into sunlight. The air is full of small freedoms, gestures she never dared to make while awake. Here, even gravity feels optional. Every breath is choice, not obligation. When she finally stirs, the dream doesn't vanish, it lingers like scent, half remembered, half felt. The body's still warm from its gentleness. She opens her eyes and smiles faintly, the world returning in slow focus. Morning will come soon, but for now, the space between sleep and waking feels infinite, like mercy. The first light is pale blue, the kind that belongs to beginnings. You can almost see the faint shimmer on the window pane, the ghost of condensation catching sunrise. The city hasn't fully woken yet. Even the birds hesitate. The world pauses between breaths, suspended in fragile balance. She moves quietly through the house, barefoot, the wood cool beneath her steps. The night's weight has lifted, but its peace remains. She opens a window, the hinges sigh softly, and the morning air slides in, damp and alive. It smells of coal smoke, dew, and the faint sweetness of bread from a distant bakery. Life returns gently, without hurry. For a moment, she simply watches the street below, a lamplighter yawning, a milk cart rattling, the faint silhouette of a chimney sweep. The city is ordinary again, and yet that ordinariness feels like grace. The same world that confined her also holds her. It is both cage and cradle. She thinks of how many mornings she's woken to expectation. Today feels different. Not freer, but clearer. The air itself seems honest. There's beauty in the way daylight doesn't care who deserves it. It touches everything equally. Roofs, cobblestones, hearts, even hers, especially hers. She closes the window, exhales, and lets the light fill the room behind her. The walls, the mirror, the chair, all washed anew. The past remains, but softer now, folded neatly in memory's drawer. The day, still blank, waits to be written. Evening returns again, gentle as forgiveness. You can almost hear the faint rustle of sheets, the sigh of linen welcoming the weight of her body. The candle flickers low, painting gold over her closed eyelids. The house, the city, the world, all exhale together. There's no performance left, no pretending, no restraint. Just the soft rhythm of breathing. Every sound feels distant, a carriage wheel, a drop of rain, the ticking clock. The body, weary but unbroken, begins to surrender, to sleep. It's the purest act of trust, to let go. In this quiet, everything finds its proper place. The fears of youth, the lessons of marriage, the ghosts of duty, all drift away like dust in sunlight. What remains is small but sacred. Warmth, breath, stillness. You can almost feel the air deepen, the heartbeat slow. Sleep, in its mercy, erases titles and vows. It asks for nothing, gives everything. In the dark, she is not wife or daughter, not virtue or possession, only a soul wrapped in silence. The world's demands dissolve at the edge of her dreams, and as her breathing steadies, the night folds around her like a gentle hand. The candle sighs once more and goes out. The darkness is not empty now. It's full of peace. Somewhere far below, the city murmurs on, unaware that within one small room, a woman has finally found rest. The night has folded itself completely around the city. You can almost hear London sleeping. A distant murmur beneath a blanket of fog and coal smoke. The streets glisten faintly under the gas lamps, and every sound feels slower, softer, like the world itself is exhaling. Inside, one candle still burns, a single flame surrounded by stillness. She lies beneath the quilt, eyes half closed, breath steady. The air carries the faint sweetness of lavender, the memory of warmth fading into calm. Her thoughts move gently now, no longer sharp, no longer hurried. They drift like silk ribbons through water, finding their place in the quiet. She is not thinking of duty or virtue anymore, not of obedience or fear. She is simply remembering what it feels like to exist without apology. It's strange, she thinks, how life can feel like a performance until the moment you finally stop performing. Only in silence do you discover who you've always been beneath the costumes of expectation. And in that silence, everything makes sense, not in words, but in feeling. The kind of understanding that doesn't need to be spoken because it's already known. The house around her sighs softly, wood settling as if in agreement. The world outside might never change, not quickly, not kindly. But within this stillness, she has changed. Awareness, once awakened, cannot be unlearned. It becomes part of the breath, the heartbeat, the very air. You can almost feel that calm wisdom radiating through her, quiet but sure. The candle burns lower, its light trembling across the ceiling. The flame seems to whisper as it fades, "You have survived the day." That's all, and it's enough. The city will wake again, the bells will ring, the world will ask her to play her part. But tonight, she owes it nothing. Tonight, she belongs only to herself. The wax collapses inward, the room dipping into darkness. And in that final breath of light, everything softens. The walls, the air, her pulse. The night is no longer something to fear. It's a lullaby. You can almost hear her last conscious exhale, slow and certain, as if surrendering to peace. Beyond the window, the fog glows faintly in moonlight. Somewhere in that quiet city, thousands of other windows fade one by one, until only the stars remain. The world rests, and so does she. Thank you for staying through the night. If your eyes are still open, let them close now. The story will wait here for you. Quiet, eternal, patient. Sleep well, traveler. Good night.